Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Shadow Drawing, How Science Taught Leonardo How to Paint, by Francesca Fiorani, narrated by Exie Sands. Prologue. We know why the candle was on Leonardo's desk, to bring light into the darkness. But why a ball and a small screen, perhaps made of thick paper or of simple wood? The shadow drawings suggest an answer. When darkness fell, and there was no other source of light in the room, Leonardo lit the candle and lined up the three, candle, ball, and screen. The small portion of the ball's surface that directly faced the candle was brightly lit, but moving outward in any direction, he could see that the remainder of the ball was left in varying degrees of shadow, as if the light never quite came its way. Where, then, did that light go instead? Depicting the light not as we see it, as one solid beam, but rather as a set of discrete rays, he charted the individual destination of each and every one, line by line. Clearly, he knew something about the science of optics, or at least how light behaves when it hits an opaque object, because with exquisite precision he identified which rays would hit the ball in a straight line and be reflected straight back to the viewer, providing that brightness, and which, because of a more acute angle of incident or impact, would hit it diagonally, leaving the edges of the ball in deeper and deeper shadow. Again and again he repeated the experiment, moving the ball closer to the light and then farther away, sometimes to the left and then to the right. He added a second source of light and examined the effect as the light from one source intersected with the light from the other, and he looked at the color of the ball and saw that it changed just as the shadows and light changed. And then there came the day he moved outside, ready to tackle the most difficult question of all: how the rays of the sun behave when they, too, meet an opaque object, such as a ball, or, one must imagine, a human form. For nothing was more important to him than the rules of optics, as one of his contemporaries noted, but in fact this obsession appears to have been very narrowly focused on just one aspect of optics: when and where light produces shadow. Every one of his notes beneath these sketches makes this point. Every shadow made by an opaque body smaller than the source of light casts derivative shadows tinged by the color of their original shadow. An opaque body will make two derivative shadows of equal darkness. Just as the thing touched by a greater mass of luminous rays becomes brighter, so that will become darker which is struck by a greater mass of shadow rays. Why this obsession with shadows? Because of some new invention or experiment he was considering? No. His goal was a different one: to learn how to paint. As a young boy, when he was taken by his father to apprentice at the most important bottega or workshop of the early Renaissance, Leonardo had learned how to draw. Given a piece of charcoal or a quill pen dipped in ink, he could sketch a complex set of figures striking poses that were simultaneously true to life and emotionally evocative. Not surprisingly, while other new apprentices were sent to wash brushes or work on the mass-produced objects meant for the middle class, Leonardo quickly joined his master, Andrea del Verrocchio, at the easel, where the most important work of the bottega was done, the paintings meant for the church or other important patrons. But that same young man who could draw almost anything had yet to learn how to paint. And by how to paint, I am not referring to how to mix colors or apply them to the panel. I am referring to the sensibility of an artist who instinctively reaches for what makes a painting a great painting. At the time, a quiet revolution was just starting to take hold in the world of Renaissance art, especially in the Bottega of Verrocchio, one that would be based upon a new kind of revelation. This revolution was not the sort achieved through faith, which is what the church wanted its paintings to convey, nor would it be based upon the fixed truths rulers expected artists to use their talents to reinforce, that each of us must know our place in the larger scheme of things, deferring to the supposedly inherent nobility of those above us. Rather, this revolution in art was founded on the notion that a new and different kind of truth was waiting to be identified by our senses and made sense of by our minds. The truth that came from careful observation. Just how this revolution would lead Leonardo to a new kind of art, one that would move viewers much more deeply, and one that speaks to us today in a way that most Renaissance painting does not, is the story this book tells. Crucial to that story, however, is the unraveling of a myth propagated, as my book will explain, by a renowned authority in the decades after his death. I am referring to the notion of Leonardo as the iconic representative of two very different forms of genius. Leonardo, it is commonly believed, is the artist who painted masterpieces such as the Ginevra da Vinci, the Mona Lisa, and the Last Supper, and drew the iconic Vitruvian Man, and then underwent a metamorphosis of sorts. Somewhere in his late 30s and early 40s, there is the emergence of a second Leonardo, the one who imagined inventions that would not come to exist until centuries later, from the parachute to the flying machine, the one who became fascinated by science and philosophy, the artist and the scientist, each exceptional in his own way, but representing different parts of the same man. The traditional characterization of this dual Leonardo is that the natural philosopher in him decided to work out scientifically what the artist had somehow vaguely intuited decades earlier. Many of us who inadvertently helped perpetuate this dual genius thesis had good reason to do so. Scholars relied, after all, on documents Leonardo himself left us, in particular his folios or notebooks. Many of the folios are dated, and based on those dates, with the exception of a few outliers, which were somehow ignored, it seemed that the vast majority of his shadow drawings, for instance, were done when Leonardo was well into his late 30s or early 40s. In other words, long after he knew how to paint, and contemporaneous with his shift toward his philosophical investigation of nature. Science was called natural philosophy back then. But do the dates written on the folios indicate what we have long assumed they indicate? Let me explain. It always surprises my students when I tell them that Leonardo was one of the least prolific painters of his time. Over a period of about 4 decades, he left us only between 12 and 15 paintings. The number changes depending on the attribution of a handful of controversial works. And a number of these he never fully completed, including, it might surprise many to learn, the Mona Lisa. If he was not busy painting, then how did Leonardo spend most of his time? He spent it writing. Leonardo was an inveterate note-taker. He got into the habit of never going out without a little notebook, just in case something caught his eye. When it did, it could be how a flock of birds seemed to hang in midair, or how water moved through a canal, or something as simple as a cat playing in the street. He would take out his notebook and write about or sketch what he had seen, or he would make a note to himself to pursue a question he could not resolve on the spot. A staggering 4,100 or so pages of sketches and notes, many supplemented with technical drawings in the style of the shadow drawings, have come down to us. But most scholars believe that what has survived represents no more than half of what Leonardo likely produced, which would mean he wrote around 8,000 pages. A more liberal estimate would place the number at 16,000. No other artist from the Renaissance left a written record of this size behind. And here's the important point. There eventually came a time, when exactly we do not know, but certainly by 1490, when Leonardo believed that by organizing and expanding the notes and drawings he had made over the years, he could eventually produce a book with the aim of teaching artists that painting is philosophy. He was aware that few painters make a profession of writing since their life is too short for its cultivation, and that, in general, they have not described and codified their art as science. Determined to do something about this, he started to take notes on what we would now call scrap paper, and in Leonardo's time, scrap paper would quickly succumb to the elements. To preserve the most important of his writings and drawings, he copied each into a new folio and assembled these reorganized sheets of paper into sets of folios, which we now refer to as Leonardo's notebooks. The shadow drawings he transferred to the largest folio set, suggesting that they were among his most important sketches. These writings, both the reorganized folio sets and the scrap paper writings that survived, could more accurately be described as a mass of rambling, fragmented, repetitious, and mostly undated notes that needed, and to this day need, thorough editing. For example, Leonardo thought nothing of writing about one topic one day on one sheet of paper, and then continuing the discussion months later on another piece of paper. Or he would add notes on a new topic to a piece of paper that already contained notes on a different topic altogether. And everything he wrote backward, so you need a mirror to read it. It is neither surprising nor unrealistic that some scholars threw up their hands when it came to these folios, describing Leonardo's writings as nothing more than a vast accumulation of words, and an unfortunate distraction from his paintings. But other scholars, dating as far back as 2 centuries ago, began what can only be described as the painstaking detective work of putting these notes in chronological order. Over time, they learned to date even the flimsiest scrap of paper, sometimes by examining the spelling conventions Leonardo used. Were they Florentine or Milanese? They studied the quality and size of the paper itself. Was it cheap or high quality, large or small? Did it have a watermark? And did Leonardo prepare the paper with colors before writing or sketching on it? They also studied the tools he used, metal point or silver point, chalk or pencil, gall ink or just dark diluted pigment, and even the look of his handwriting. Was it firm or trembling? Above all, they looked to the layout of each of his folios for clues, paying particularly close attention to how he arranged drawings and words on the page. 2 conclusions emerged from this detective work, conclusions that have shaped our understanding of the life and work of Leonardo. First, based largely on the only reliably dated folios, scholars concluded that Leonardo started to write in earnest only around 1490, when he was in his late 30s. There are a few folios from earlier, between 1478 and 1480, when he was in his late 20s, but these were seen as exceptional. Second, since everything he preserved in these folios was of a philosophical or scientific nature, even when they discussed painting, which a great deal of the material did, scholars concluded that these writings documented Leonardo's increasing distance from the world of art and his turn toward science and philosophy. As this scholarly consensus formed, no one explicitly intended to dismiss the possibility that science played a role in shaping young Leonardo as an artist. It was just that Leonardo's writings about the science of art from his mature years were so numerous in comparison to the surviving writings from his youth, and so few scholars considered the possibility that the stunning paintings produced by a young Leonardo might be the result of early exposure to science and philosophy. Nor did anyone challenge the notion that much of the material in the folios was likely a carefully copied version of discarded scrap paper notes that could have been made years, if not decades, earlier. Rather, the details of young Leonardo's possible engagement with science were neglected as attention was focused on his later writings and scientific pursuits. This focus, however, has obscured as much as it has revealed. I am part of a group of art scholars who believe that the stress on answering the question of when and how Leonardo became a scientist has inadvertently prevented us from understanding something much more interesting. The possibility that Leonardo did not suddenly become a scientist at all. At the heart of the scientific mindset is curiosity, the need to understand and explain the seemingly inexplicable, and Leonardo showed a great deal of curiosity in his early work. If science meant so much to the young Leonardo, why, you might ask, did he not, like Galileo Galilei, devote himself to science from the start? Why, of all things, painting? That question is easy to answer. It was the only outlet available to him. As an illegitimate son, he was denied the right to a higher education by the laws of the time. He was lucky to have learned how to read and write and do elementary math. Had he not shown such a strong desire at an early age to observe and record nature in drawings, suggesting he might succeed as an artist's apprentice, he would likely have been turned over by his father to the church, to spend the rest of his days contemplating the divine. Fortunately, while the law may have constrained the options available to illegitimate children, the arts themselves did not. To the contrary, an artist's studio was the ideal setting for a child like Leonardo, who would be not only exposed to philosophical and scientific ideas, but encouraged to seek them out, and to use them in the service of the arts. Of course, it is not just Leonardo who has come down to us as an example of dual genius. The Renaissance is still most often described as a time when art and science both thrived, but separately. That is how I, too, saw the Renaissance until my undergraduate days at the University of Rome, when I attended a lecture by Professor Corrado Maltese. That day, he pointed out that we have lost sight of the true Renaissance. It was, he argued, a time when artists were deeply interested in science, not apart from their art, but because of it. Renaissance artists, the professor insisted, had enormous respect for what science could teach them, because Renaissance artists were taught that artists could make visible for society what we know, only after science explained how we know it, an inversion of the artist-to-scientist hypothesis often applied to Leonardo. Artists and artisans followed science closely. From science, they learned how to be better painters, better sculptors, better metallurgists, better architects, better everything, and watched their art and that of others deepen as science explained more and more. Maltese taught us how to decode Renaissance art and to look for evidence of the scientific principles artists used to create their works. Indeed, as my book will show, shortly after his arrival at the workshop of Andrea del Verrocchio, Leonardo would be given a fascinating opportunity. He would witness, and perhaps assist with, the painstaking experiments that his master conducted in order to design the golden orb that sits atop Brunelleschi's dome of the Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore in Florence. He learned early on that there were philosophical and scientific truths that could help him make art, and that those truths could teach him what he desperately wanted to know: how to paint. Most often, those truths were truths of optics. Long before the Renaissance, artists understood that how a person holds his face and body unconsciously reveals a great deal about how that person sees himself or wishes to be seen by others. The smirking smile needs no further explanation, nor do drooping shoulders. But artists also understood that much of what we really feel is revealed by almost imperceptible details. Here is where the science of optics enters the picture. A figure striking a pose creates countless shadows, in the folds of a garment, as well as in the lines and creases of a forehead or around the lips. Every tilt of the body or head casts its own subtle pattern of shadows against a floor or wall. By paying attention to these shadows, an artist with some knowledge of optics could work backward from the interplay of light and dark to more accurately render the human form, and to better convey the emotions it expressed. But if optics informed Leonardo's art almost from the start, how might he have acquired this knowledge? There were books in Latin, a language Leonardo never mastered, that taught the science of optics. And there was an 11th century manuscript titled Book of Optics by the Arab philosopher known in the Renaissance as Al-Hasan. His real name was Abu Ali al-Hasan ibn al-Haytham. That Renaissance artists knew about because it had been translated into the vernacular. A copy of this Italian translation was in the hands of an artist Leonardo knew. We know that Leonardo would take notes whenever he read a book. Not surprisingly, written on scraps of paper and in his notebooks are thoughts that are so deeply aligned with Al-Hasan's book that they seem, at times, nearly direct quotes from it, such as Al-Hasan's belief in the truthfulness of sensory experience, which Leonardo rephrased as, "Experience does not err, but rather your judgments err when they hope to exact effects that are not within her power." Even the way Leonardo described painting as an activity that embraces all the 10 functions of the eye, that is to say darkness, light, body and color, shape and location, distance and closeness, motion and rest, is a rephrasing of Al-Hasan's description of the 8 conditions that make proper human vision possible: distance between eye and object, a facing orientation, light, size, opacity, transparency in the air, time, and a healthy eye. Leonardo also declared that his little work, Piccola Opera, the book on painting he planned to assemble from his notes, will comprise an interweaving of these functions, stressing the connection between optics and art. Even his description of painting as being grounded in optics, prospettiva, which was nothing else than a rational demonstration, ragione dimostrativa, by which experience confirms that all things send their semblance to the eye by pyramidal lines, reads like a sentence from an optical text. When Leonardo wrote that experience was the mother of every certainty, and that true sciences are those which have penetrated through the senses as a result of experience, he seemed to be echoing scientific studies of optics in general, and Al-Hasan's in particular. But why are these thoughts and quotations so important to the argument I am trying to make? When I began to think about writing this book, I made myself a promise. Instead of standing at a remove, I would try to imagine myself standing behind Leonardo in an attempt to see the world through his eyes as he stopped to sketch something that caught his attention, or as he sat struggling to write his unfinished book, which would affirm that painting is philosophy. And here is what that practice has made clear to me. Earlier, I suggested that as a child, Leonardo had an insatiable need to make sense of the world. To do so, he employed the only tools then available to him, his senses, in particular his eyes. And then he recorded that sensory data in the only way he knew how, by making little drawings. Recalling what my professor Corrado Maltese told me many years ago, how Renaissance artists saw art as expression of what science revealed, I began to ask myself a question I had never asked before. Did Leonardo see each of his paintings as an experiment that would give him a novel opportunity to refine his understanding of optics and its ability to help him capture human emotions in paint? The recent emergence of a new shadow drawing lends support to this hypothesis. Carmen Bambach, an expert on Leonardo, who is the curator of Italian and Spanish drawings at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, has dated it convincingly to Leonardo's 20s. What this means is that Leonardo was starting to consider scientific questions, especially those posed by the science of optics, from his earliest days as a painter. My own readings of Leonardo's work offer further evidence in support of this argument. Consider his first solo painting, Annunciation. Leonardo placed Mary outside rather than indoors. At the heart of this painting is the divine shadow that will come over her and make her pregnant. That shadow is like no other shadow I have ever seen in Renaissance art. Optics can explain why. I have also tried to understand what must have gone through Leonardo's mind when he chose to abandon the adoration of the Magi and the Mona Lisa. Was the reason, in the case of the former, that he failed to achieve the optical rigor he had come to expect of himself? And could the latter no longer hold his attention once he had accomplished, or failed to accomplish, a demonstration of the scientific principles he had set out to understand? And then there was the book on painting that Leonardo spent much of his life planning, but that he never completed. He intended for it to explain why painting is grounded in optics and why the illusion of depth created by light and shadow is the soul of painting. But why was it so difficult for so many scholars to make sense of what Leonardo was trying to accomplish? Because everyone who tried to do so approached it as a book about painting, when in fact it was to be a book about science for painters. It is really a chronicle of scientific discoveries, a subject typically written about in a language that Leonardo himself did not speak. Leonardo's use of art to investigate science also goes against conventions of patronage during the Renaissance. The church still largely maintained a stranglehold on art. Yes, paintings could generate emotional responses, but only certain ones, most often a sense of rapture with the aim of inspiring devotion. Alternatively, for the Medici and other families in the upper echelons of society, the desired message was one of strength, dignity, and power. In a pre-literate society, where even sermons were still delivered in Latin, the best way the church could tell its stories and leaders could address the public was through art. There is a reason many paintings from this era seem to have no center, no main focus, but rather a thread that needs to be followed from character to character. In this respect, Leonardo was being asked to play a role for which he was never quite suited. There was no place for his art to find its own grammar and its own voice, or to express its own sensibility. When forced to choose between his own comfort and security and using painting for his own ends, Leonardo invariably chose the latter. Who was the man who gave us this legacy? By all accounts, Leonardo was fun to be around, a great talker, and a fabulous dinner companion. He knew how to tell jokes, and sang beautifully to his own accompaniment on the lyre, to the delight of the entire court. He even knew how to entertain a crowd with witty debates on lofty topics. In one famous debate, he defended the superiority of painting over mathematics. His taste was impeccable, and he won fame as an arbiter and inventor of all matters pertaining to beauty and elegance, especially spectacles and performances. In old age, he stood out for his long beard that came to the middle of his breast and was well combed and curled. He resembled an ancient philosopher, which is how his longtime assistant and companion Francesco Melzi portrayed him in a drawing that has since become Leonardo's official image. But when working, he went into a kind of trance, forgetting food, time, friends, and everything else. He was volatile, alternating between sociability and social withdrawal. He was a compulsive draftsman and sketched constantly, scribbling on any piece of paper that crossed his desk, sometimes even on the panels of his paintings. Always he carried a little notebook in his pocket to draw whatever attracted his attention. He did not build close relationships, he did not have children, and he never married. But he was close to his apprentices, even though none of his disciples was of great fame. The two of them who joined his workshop in their teens remained with him until his death. He was well aware of his talent. Read me, reader, if in my words you find delight, for rarely in the world will one such as I be born again. He jotted down in one of his notebooks when he was in his early 40s, at the pinnacle of his fame at the court of Milan. He had great difficulty finishing the things he set out to do, however. His soul was never quieted. He would delve into a specific topic and write frantically for months on end, and then abruptly abandon it. He never published a single page of the thousands he wrote. He was hypercritical of his own work and urged other artists to be the same way, as perfect works will bestow upon you more honor than money would do. An eyewitness reported how for days he stood in front of his Last Supper without touching the work with his hand, staying for 1 or 2 hours of the day only to contemplate, consider, and examine his figures in solitude, in order to judge them. He did finish that painting, but there were many others that he did not. Some say that he left his projects incomplete because he knew so much and this did not allow him to work, or because he was always in search of new means and refined artistic techniques. One of Leonardo's acquaintances, who was a physician, thought the reason was his volubility of character and his natural impatience, a trait that caused him always to discard his early ideas. The fact is that there was no way to get Leonardo to do something he did not want to do. Kings and princes, even a pope, begged him for work and promised wonderful rewards, but he would do nothing if he did not have the right motivation. Money did not move him to action, even though he needed plenty to afford the lavish lifestyle he became accustomed to. Nor did fame, and he acquired much during his lifetime. For Leonardo, the focus was on the inner emotional lives of the people he portrayed, including how they reacted in the face of the divine. It is his emphasis on the human, on how human beings instinctually react to others and to the world, that gives his paintings such a modern feel, that allows them to continue to speak to us even after 500 years. Part 1. How Science Taught Leonardo How to Paint. 1. The Right Place at the Right Time. The teenage boy who showed up for an apprenticeship at the bottega of Andrea del Verrocchio was, it seemed, a work of art in his own right. He was possessed of such extraordinary beauty it was said that nature seemed to have produced a miracle in him. The boy's name was Leonardo. He was at most 13 or 14 years old. His father, a well-connected notary, had sought out the apprenticeship for his son, for there was no finer or more dedicated teacher than Andrea del Verrocchio, and no artist who knew more about the sciences, particularly geometry, as an early biographer of Andrea noted. The workshop of Leonardo's new master was on the southeast side of Florence, about half a mile from the city's magnificent cathedral, in the neighborhood of Sant'Ambrogio. It was there that painters, goldsmiths, sculptors, dyers, woodworkers, and stonemasons kept shop. The neighborhood buzzed with activity, and it remains as lively today as it was when Leonardo lived there 500 years ago. Farmers from the countryside came every day to erect their stalls in the market, and visitors from other cities flocked there to buy the luxury goods for which Florentine craftsmen were famous. The small parish church lay at the heart of the neighborhood, and the craftsmen who lived nearby cared deeply for it, even though it could hardly compare to Florence's cathedral and its towering dome. It was in one of the small houses lining the neighborhood's narrow streets, amidst the shouts of workers and shoppers, the clanging of tools from the workshops, and the scent of spices from the market, that Leonardo learned how to paint, and where he also sketched his first shadow drawings. During the Renaissance, sons typically followed their father's professions. The sons of doctors studied medicine at the university, those of craftsmen trained in their father's workshops, and the offspring of merchants went to abacus school to learn essential skills of their trade. Had Leonardo been a legitimate son, he would have followed a similar path. He would have studied law at the university and become a notary like his father and his great-grandfather. But Ser Piero had conceived him out of wedlock with a household servant named Caterina, Leonardo's grandfather proudly recorded the arrival of the boy, his first grandson, in the family memory book. There was born to me a grandson, the son of Ser Piero, my son, on the 15th day of April, a Saturday, at the 3rd hour of the night. He bears the name Leonardo. But in other, more fundamental ways, the boy was not.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?